I'm sorry about the topic today is Jeffrey Epstein and the infamous Fire and Fury podcast. I'm not sure what this is going to unfold from this, but
The latest now on Jeffrey Epstein, the financier accused of sex trafficking underage girls. As more accusers come forward, his attorneys are proposing a mega million-dollar bail.
Basically, is Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein having a conversation behind the scenes stories never heard before recordings of Michael's recounts of Epstein's candid insight into Epstein's rise and Trump's rise, revealing the world of power plays, unsettling competitions and twisted allegations. The conversations unearths Epstein's perspectives on Trump's character, ambition, and his relentless pursuit of power.
Had enough of this country? Ever dreamt about starting your own?
I planted the flag. This is mine. I own this.
It's surprisingly easy.
We have 55 gallons of water, 500 pounds of concrete.
Or maybe not.
No country willingly gives up their territory.
Oh my God.
What is that?
Bullets.
Listen to Escape from Zakistan. That's Escape from ZAQ-istan on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey guys, I'm Kate Mack, Apple Podcasts, or wherever.
4 on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good morning, Michael.
James.
So, the end. Days to go. I know you spent Sunday with 10,000 of your closest friends in Madison Square Garden, but
20,000.
50,000. A million. We'll set that aside for a moment because there's something I'd like to talk to you about, something we've talked privately about before, but I don't think you've ever talked about this publicly. A particular secret source when you wrote Fire and Fury, right?
Well, I had many secret sources.
But this was a particular secret source.
Quite particular. It was Trump's old friend, Jeffrey Epstein. That Jeffrey Epstein. I think we have a snippet from one of the conversations that I recorded with Epstein, and I think this was in a restaurant in 2017.
His people fight each other.
Right.
And then have outsiders. He sort of poisons the well outside. He will tell 10 people Bannon's a scumbag, and Priest is not doing a good job, and Kelly has a big mouth. And what do you think? Jamie Dimon says you're a problem, and I shouldn't keep you. And I spoke to Carl Icahn, and Carl thinks I need a new spokesperson. So Kelly, even though I hired Kellyanne's husband, Kellyanne is just too much of a wild card. And then he tells Bannon, I really want to keep you, but Kellyanne hates you.
I have more than dozens. I probably have 100 hours of Epstein talking about the inner workings of the Trump White House and about his long-standing, deep relationship with Donald Trump. And that is this week on Fire and Fury, the podcast. Welcome to Fire and Fury, the podcast. I'm Michael Wolff.
And I'm James Truman. Well, this past week, the Epstein-Trump connection surfaced again when a well-known model of the 90s, Stacey Williams, gave an interview saying that while she was dating Epstein, he introduced her to Trump, and Trump, virtually upon their introduction, well, let me quote as the New York Times reported it. As Trump and Mr. Epstein chatted, Mr. Trump groped Miss Williams, she said. Mr. Trump pulled Miss Williams toward him and touched her breasts, waist, and buttocks. She said, it was like an octopus, she said. I was utterly confused and frozen. After they left Trump Tower, Mr. Epstein just berated me for allowing that to happen, Miss Williams said. She added that she often wondered whether she'd been part of a bet or a challenge between the two men. I definitely felt like it was a piece of meat delivered to that office as some sort of game.
Yeah, I mean, I heard this story from Epstein. In his telling, he was pissed, but at the same time, he seemed to think it was funny, I guess, or Trumpian. And I remember him specifically saying Donald was incapable of not trying to cop a feel.
Obviously, there have been rumors about Epstein and Trump and their relationship for a long time. I mean, Trump denies it, though he's also been quoted as extolling Epstein and his young women. How much do you know about Jeffrey and Donald?
Quite a bit. When I was writing Fire and Fury, I became an outlet for Epstein to express his incredulity about someone whose sins he knew so well, and then this person actually being elected president. Mm-hmm. Epstein was utterly preoccupied with Trump, and I think, frankly, afraid of him.
Before he was president, or
in the run-up, as it became clearer that there was the possibility that Trump might be president, and I even at that point thought that there was no possibility, but Epstein was pretty convinced that, I mean, he kept saying, I know Donald Trump, and he's going to win.
Wow.
I mean, so many of the people who have been around Trump and burned by him have become obsessed with him. I mean, and I think it's partly all about that question. How could this have happened? How could this person, who we have seen how he behaves, actually have then become the president of the United States? And Epstein knew him really, I think, better than most. I mean, this was a true BFF situation. Two playboys very much styling themselves as playboys in that Hefner sense, who palled around for the better part of 15 years. This was a relationship that began in the late 80s, 87 or 88, I think, and continued until they had a fight over real estate, the thing rich guys fight over.
That's right.
In 2004. There's a particular story that Epstein tells, and it's from the late 80s, maybe 89, maybe 90, and it's about Brooklyn real estate. Mm-hmm. So Trump's father, Fred, was making him look at real estate in Brooklyn, a big piece of land and lots of old buildings that they could buy. Now, this was the last place that Donald Trump wanted to be associated with. I mean, he had kind of styled himself, been reborn as this Manhattan guy.
Yeah.
But his father was making him do it. And he brought Epstein along to look at this property with him. And I remember Epstein described Trump came in his limo to pick Epstein up, and Epstein was waiting for Trump on the street with two beautiful girls, I don't know, models. They each were holding a dog on a leash, those Afghans.
Jesus. Huge dogs.
Huge dogs. But then Trump got there and he jumps out of the car and he says, no dogs, no dogs. I don't want any dogs in the car. And then Epstein responds, then no girls. So the dogs came along and then they went to Brooklyn, and then Epstein kept making fun of him the whole way because he was going to have to become a Brooklyn real estate guy.
Right.
And then Epstein said, I'm not going to associate with you anymore if you're a Brooklyn real estate guys. And the girls, no more girls, Donald.
So what was their bond? What did they actually see in each other?
I think that they were 1980s guys. I mean, I think they saw themselves as this was their time, and they were the embodiment of that moment, which was money, women, and status. I mean, the money was all about the deal, playing the angles, essentially get rich quick schemes.
Yeah.
And whether it was Trump's real estate stuff and who he was borrowing money and how he was borrowing money, or it was Epstein's, a million schemes, I guess money laundering schemes.
Yeah. Was Epstein rich at this time?
But you never know how much they certainly looked like they were rich. They were certainly living like they were rich. Epstein had a plane. I mean, the plane for Epstein, and I think also for Trump, became the way of being rich. If you had a plane, then obviously you were rich. And this was the dawn of people having their own private planes.
Yeah.
And Epstein and Trump were kind of interesting in distinguished that they didn't get, G4s or whatever. They got, 757s. I mean, so
they
were
got
going
all
around
requisitioned airline planes.
I mean, these big planes, which they would then redecorate in kind of baronial style.
Yeah.
And the women were all about kind of top level pulchritude models. I mean, this was the 1980s. Models were the sexual currency of the time. I mean, the social currency too. And they were very competitive about the women. So Stacey Williams recalling that there was a competition, I think is probably exactly accurate. I mean, there was one point in which they had a competition about who would be the first one who would sleep with Princess Diana. Now, I don't think that ever happened. But
I don't believe so.
And there was a thing. There was a period in which he was brought in to be a Princess Diana walker.
Wow.
And in other words, when he would be seated next to her, when the seat became empty, these guys were playing at the highest stakes they could play. I mean, there was constant kind of betting about who could get what girl first. Yeah. And then the status thing was all about what money could buy and what it could buy in that golden crusted Trump sense.
Yeah.
And real estate, of course. I mean, it was always about what real estate could be bought. I think Epstein saw Trump as essentially Bush League. His old man was rich, but he was from Queens. And I think Trump saw Epstein, the Brooklyn guy, who had achieved this kind of level of cool, which was, I think, had a lot to do with the Victoria's Secret relationship. Epstein had this relationship
with Les Wexner.
Wexner. And again, it's models. Fundamentally at the center of this was 1980s and model culture.
Is it too prosaic to ask, did Epstein actually like Trump?
I think it pleased Epstein that he could look down on Trump. Trump, the vulgarian.
I would say
vulgarian. So it's just a kind of relative. I'm more vulgar than you. And I can't tell if I'm more vulgar than you. The more vulgar you got, elevated your status. Or I don't know. Epstein believed that part of his attraction to Trump is that he had the better plane and that Trump could ride on his plane because actually at this time, Trump was in the midst of his big financial difficulties.
Yeah.
So who had the plane was a balance of power thing.
Yeah.
There was a story Epstein told about coming up from Palm Beach with Trump, and they're on Epstein's plane. And they were with Epstein's girlfriend at the time, and Trump was trying to impress her. I think, again, this is part of this constant competition. And Trump wanted to get Epstein to divert the plane to go to Atlantic City so they could go to one of Trump's casinos. And the girl in question, who was European, didn't know, what Atlantic City was. And Trump was saying that Atlantic City was going to be the new Las Vegas. And Trump was going to be the king of the new Las Vegas. And Epstein then told the girl Trump was the king, but he was the white trash king, and Atlantic City was the white trash kingdom.
I mean, you can imagine that being said as sort of bro bonhomie, or you can imagine it being said with kind of secret disgust from one to the other.
I think this was part of the patter that went on, but I think it was this constant balancing of status. Who was up, who was down, who was the real cool guy, and who was the fake cool guy, and whose riches were richer.
Yeah.
And whose girls were higher on the 1980s girl hierarchy.
Do we know if at this time Epstein was hanging out with the underage girls, or was that something he kept closeted and away from his coterie of the people around him?
At this point, I don't know. I mean, certainly later, I think it was clear. I mean, that was sort of the Palm Beach phase.
Yeah.
I think it began there. And then Trump was certainly kind of in and out of Epstein's house and world. So I think knew something about that. But I think at this point, it was part of this competition, part of how did the girls elevate you? I mean, they enjoyed the competition, and I think that Trump was envious about Epstein's girlfriends, which included actresses and models. I mean, Stacey Williams, the model who has just come forward, you know, a very kind of well-known model of the moment, Sports Illustrated swimsuit model. So I think that this was always part of the admiration that Trump had for Epstein. And in fact, there was a moment in which they shared a girlfriend.
Literally shared a girlfriend?
I mean, they were both openly, possibly proudly, going out with the same girl at the same time.
Do you know who that was?
I do, yeah.
Can you tell us?
No, I wouldn't. No. But, let me just make the point that in a moment in time, there was a particular kind of sexual excess and license and cruelty, masculine cruelty, rich guy masculine cruelty, that was not just allowed, but celebrated. And I think that Epstein and Trump really were two of its exaggerated exponents. Of course, we see now Epstein as the sexual monster, but certainly, at least in Epstein's telling, he and Trump were pretty much in this regard brothers in arms. There was a beauty pageant that was organized at Mar-a-Lago. Remember, Trump is in the pageant business. And Trump organized it and put it together. It was Miss something or other. And, girls were brought in and they were told it was a big deal, a major event, and flown into Mar-a-Lago. And when they arrived on the Mar-a-Lago stage, these girls for the beauty pageant, the only people there to see them were Epstein and Trump.
I mean, was there any awareness on Epstein's part that there was something gross going on here? Or was he an equal participant?
I mean, I certainly never got an indication that Epstein was questioning himself.
Yeah.
But in fact, he seemed to regard Trump's behavior as somehow proving that his own was far more reasonable.
Ah, interesting.
I remember he said about Trump, now, of course, this is Jeffrey Epstein saying this, which actually kind of magnifies the description. But he said that Trump has no scruples.
Good Lord. Wow. A great insight with an absolute lack of self-knowledge.
We'll be back right after the break.
Is your country falling apart? Feeling tired?
No country willingly gives up their territory.
I was making a rocket
show where I run with celebrities, athletes, entrepreneurs, and more. Join me every week for Post Run High. It's where we take the conversation beyond the run and get into the heart of it all. It's It's lighthearted, pretty crazy, and very fun. Listen to Post Run High on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, James Brown, B.B. King, Miriam Makeba.
I shook up the world.
James Brown said, say it loud. And the kid said, I'm black and I'm proud.
Black boxing stars and black music royalty together in the heart of Zaire, Africa.
3 days of music and then the boxing event.
What was going on in the world at the time made this fight as important as anything else.
Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast.
Epstein, he said that Trump had a fetish. Again, this is according to Epstein.
Yeah.
About trying to sleep with his friends' wives. That this was high sport for Donald Trump. And Epstein seemed to draw the line here. And Epstein had a story that he said that Trump used to invite the prospective wife to his office and then get the husband on the phone, but not tell the husband that the wife was sitting there listening, and then engage the husband in sex talk about who he was fucking.
Oh, come on. Do you believe that happened? Boggles the mind.
Yeah, I'm just reporting. I actually included that story in Fire and Fury.
I mean, it's so medieval. It's like the king sleeping with his subaltern's bride on the wedding night. I mean, it's really dark.
There was a scene in the early 90s, I think, and they were at a place in New York called the China Club, which was a moment in time place on the Upper West Side, as I recall. And Epstein describes Trump pinning a waitress against the bar as the room looks on.
As the room looks on. Yeah. So there was an exhibitionist quality to this as well.
I mean,
it was like getting away with it quality,
yeah,
right? I can get away with it.
I think this was this moment in time. I can only explain it like that because one cannot imagine this occurring now or even at any moment in the last generation.
Yeah. And was Trump married at this time?
Well, I think Trump was in and out of these marriages, of which Epstein was particularly involved with. There's a woman, Jill Harth, and she's on her in Ivanka's bedroom at Mar-a-Lago.
And what was the story about when Marla Maples was pregnant?
And then Marla Maples got, before they were married, got pregnant, and according to Epstein, he and Trump spent a lot of time about how to deal with this. With Trump clearly did not want to have the child, and what were his options, what were his recourses, and how could he convince Marla Maples not to have the child, which he seems not to have succeeded in doing.
Yeah. This is getting creepy.
Yeah, no. I mean, let's get to the creepiest framing of this, which is, here are these two guys, both driven by a need to do anything they wanted with women, dominance and submission and entertainment. And one of them ends up in the darkest prison in the country and the other in the White House.
Yes.
Explain that. I think this was this moment in time. I can only explain it like that because one cannot imagine this occurring now or even at any moment in the last generation.
Yeah. And was Trump married at this time?
I think Ivanka. Trump was in and out of these marriages, of which Epstein was particularly involved with. There's a woman named Jill Harth, and she's made this accusation public that Trump jumped on her in Ivanka's bedroom at Mar-a-Lago.
And what was the story about when Marla Maples was pregnant?
And then Marla Maples got before they were married, got pregnant, and according to Epstein, he and Trump spent a lot of time about how to deal with this. With Trump clearly did not want to have the child, and what were his options, what were his recourses, and how could he convince Marla Maples not to have the child, which he seems not to have succeeded in doing.
Yeah. This is getting creepy.
Yeah, no. I mean, let's get to the creepiest framing of this, which is, here are these two guys, both driven by a need to do anything they wanted with women, dominance and submission and entertainment. And one of them ends up in the darkest prison in the country and the other in the White House.
Yes.
Explain that.
I can think of one other thing they have in common. They both had putative fortunes whose origin was about the most obscure thing you could imagine, of whether they actually had any money, whether it was all bluff. I mean, what was Epstein's perspective on Trump's fortune?
Yeah, well, he spent a lot of time, and he was kind of fascinated by this and knowledgeable. I mean, Epstein maintained that he spent as much time talking about women, they talked about money, which clearly makes sense. And in Epstein's view, Trump had no money, that it was all an illusion, and that his net worth simply derived from ignoring his liabilities. And in Epstein's theory about Trump's hidden tax returns was that during the 1990s, when Trump was in extremis and the banks forgave him liabilities of almost $1 billion. And Epstein pointed out that the forgiveness of those debts should have shown up as income, but that would have amounted to a $500 million tax bill, assuming Trump is in a 50% category, which of course he would be. Trump obviously didn't have the money because he had no money, which is why he had to be forgiven these debts. Hence, this forgiveness never showed up on his returns. In fact, the money thing or the real estate thing was then involved with their falling out.
Yeah, what were the circumstances of that? I mean, Trump, revisionist, says, I just realized he was not a good guy, right? And ended the friendship, but obviously that was not it.
Let's see. I mean, that's that other layer of this, that Trump has been able to just kind of say, pay no attention to this. I really didn't. There are the pictures here and there are this and that. And, the whole timeline of a relationship, but pay no attention
in another
to
universe that happened. Yeah. Extraordinary.
I never really knew him. But in 2004, Epstein had the high bid on a house in Palm Beach. I think the bid was $36 million. And then he brought Trump along to give him some advice about moving the swimming pool. And it was interesting that Epstein would say Trump was not really a real estate guy in the mogul sense because he couldn't do deals, he couldn't read a balance sheet. Epstein would say he was innumerate, which has to do with the exaggeration of Trump's numbers all the time. They just free-floated in his head. But Epstein said that actually Trump was a very good contractor. He brought Trump along to give him some advice about moving the swimming pool. But then Trump went around Epstein's back and bid $40 million for the house. So this is classic rich guy breakdown.
Totally, yeah.
But then Epstein knew that Trump didn't have the money. Therefore, Epstein's conclusion was that he must be fronting for someone.
Sure.
And in fact, in that classic money laundering setup, Trump bought the house for $40 million, bought it through borrowed money. And then the house was put on the market not long afterwards and then immediately sold for $96 million.
To who?
To one of the oligarchs in the close Putin circle. I mean, it's like, okay, neon. So Epstein was pissed, of course. And he began to threaten lawsuits and he began to threaten press exposure. I mean, he was really, really, really pissed when those guys lose a dream house.
Yeah.
And that was the point at which Epstein's own legal problems. The problems with the girls began. And certainly in Epstein's telling, this all happened because it was Trump who first dropped the dime on him.
Oh, is that right?
And Trump would have known about the girls because he was in and out of Epstein's house.
Yeah.
When Epstein and I were talking about this, and Trump was now the president of the United States, and I think frightening. I mean, frightening both because the most inappropriate person to be the president of the United States was probably Donald Trump.
Yes.
But also, I couldn't help but feel that there was a level of personal fear there.
Yeah.
So he's having this conversation with me. And as I say, I'm writing Fire and Fury. I'm trying to figure out Donald Trump. It's as confounding to me, of course, as it was to everybody. Who is this guy?
Yeah.
How did this happen? But in having this conversation, Epstein, on more than one occasion, would bring out these photographs that he had of Trump. And there were about a half a dozen photographs, and they were, from the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
They were Trump at Epstein's Palm Beach house.
Yeah.
Sitting around the pool with these young girls. And the young girls are topless, and in some of the pictures, they're sitting in his lap. I mean,
whoa.
And then there's one I especially remember where there's a stain, a telltale stain on the front of Trump's pants, and the girls are pointing at him and laughing.
Where are these pictures?
He would go and he would take them out of the safe.
Yeah.
And then he would return them to the safe. And I would say it was likely that they would have been there when the FBI, Trump's FBI at that point, not to put too fine a point on it, raided Epstein's house and took the contents of the safe in 2019.
Wow. Is there a Steve Bannon connection in this? There's been a lot of reports about Epstein and Bannon.
I introduced them.
I
mean, this is...
You will go to heaven, Michael.
This is the thing. I'm talking to both of those guys, and they both wanted to meet each other. So here I am in the middle of this.
When was this?
This would have been after Bannon was pushed out of the White House.
Like 2017?
Yeah, so it would have been probably the fall of 2017.
And Trump had fallen out several years before this.
Yeah, that was, remember, they fell out in 2004. So Epstein is just watching Trump, the guy he knows, from the sidelines. And then Bannon has fallen out with Trump. So they instantly bonded. I mean, I saw this immediately. It was like two long-lost brothers, and they couldn't get enough of each trying to explain Donald Trump to the other, but even to themselves. I think they both hated Donald Trump, or he had come to be so big in their head that they hated him. And then they were confounded by this phenomenon. So again, it was how to explain this. And then I remember exactly the moment they were introduced. Bannon said to Epstein, "You were the only person I was afraid of in 2016." Because Bannon knew that Epstein and Trump had been close, and I think that he assumed that was not going to be good news for someone running to be the president of the United States. And he also knew that in 2016, 60 Minutes was planning an Epstein-Trump expose.
What happened to that?
I suppose the same thing that happened to all Epstein-Trump reports. These two guys were friends for 15 years. The president of the United States and the most vilified sexual predator of the age, and yet somehow we know very little about this. I know that every time that I've tried to tell what I know about this story, I've met a "do we really want to go there" response. It's like, Epstein is just too hot to handle. So I don't know. I mean, I've actually spoken to the 60 Minutes producer who was trying to do this. I think that you get to the level of the allegations and the implications are so large
Yeah, that's right.
Unless you have the smoking gun.
Yes.
And so anecdotal evidence, even a pile-on of it, which I think we're offering here, is something that large media outlets stay away from.
I mean, do you think Epstein committed suicide in jail or was he murdered?
I mean, I was always startled by how afraid he seemed about Trump. And I've spoken to several other people who knew Epstein well, and they make the same point and wondering what that's about. And I know that Epstein would emphasize how he believed Trump was capable of doing anything. He had no scruples. And I urged Epstein to go public with everything I've told you here, but Epstein's attitude was that I was clearly unaware of how the real world operated. So in the end, Epstein died in prison, and we'll probably never hear that story.
I remember you once said to me, and I think you were quoting someone else, that Epstein couldn't have killed himself in jail. It also made no sense that he was murdered in jail. Do you remember that?
Yeah, no. I mean, the descriptions of how he died seem completely implausible. To have to break your own neck. But the idea of him being murdered seems to also imply that you would have all of these assistant U.S. attorneys and FBI agents who had to keep their mouths shut.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
yes.
Here we are, and Jeffrey Epstein's old friend may be about to become the president again. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Michael. Extra podcasts we're doing because the last one we did lit the blue touch paper in ways that I think neither of us had quite imagined. Became one of the most listened to podcasts in the country, was denounced by the Trump team, which we'll come to, and it was discussed in Congress on Friday as a possible investigation of the FBI's practice in arresting and confiscating Jeffrey Epstein's materials. So, wow.
Which goes to what I've always found and always thought, that the name Epstein makes people go crazy.
Well, it sure seems to have done. I mean, we've been posting some of these clips on the Daily Beast, so they've been somewhat available.
And let me just also point out that the Daily Beast has been incredibly helpful, because a lot of these tapes are of poor quality, which would be largely my fault, because I seem to barely know how to work a tape recorder, even the voice memo function on the iPhone. The Daily Beast has subtitles on this material, and we can't have subtitles here, but I will do my best to interpret the problematic places. More on my interviews with Jeffrey Epstein about Donald Trump coming up. Welcome to Fire and Fury, the podcast. I'm Michael Wolff.
And I'm James Truman. Michael, can you just set the scene for a moment for us here of where you were, what the vibe was between the two of you, how the conversation arrived at this point?
Yeah, let me do two things. Let's just briefly set up the thing. What we have here in this clip is Epstein talking about Trump's methods of seducing the wives of his friends.
He's not a horrible human being in Jeffrey, but he does nasty things to his best friends' wives. Anyone who first tries to gain your trust and then uses it to do bad things. That's how it goes.
In this specific way, he would seduce the wives of his friends, and he would have someone into his office. He'd make an appointment to see them. And at the same time, he'd get the wife on the speakerphone, and the husband would not know that the wife was listening into this conversation. And then Trump would prompt him to essentially begin to talk about sex and begin to talk about issues he might have with his wife. and then offer girls to this person. And that would essentially be the way that Trump would seduce the wife, secretly listening in on the phone. You've asked the question about where. So there were two places that Epstein and I usually talked. As a scene setter, he lived in one of the largest private residences in Manhattan. Was on East 71st Street on the Park Block, a gargantuan house. I used to take, there are those big townhouses on the Park Blocks of the Upper East Side, but then there was Epstein's house. So I would often take people by the house and point it out and say, that's where Jeffrey Epstein lives. And it invariably got a guffaw. That's how big this house is. So the conversations took place either in his dining room, which is in the back of the house. It's a very large dining room around a table that I guess would seat comfortably 30. And that's where from morning till night, he had people in constantly. It was kind of a meeting in constant progress with new faces, new personalities joining throughout the day. And you could have any food that you want. It was like, what would you like? Literally anything was on offer. It would be made and then it would come out. And actually, this was always kind of awkward because he would say, what would you like? Would you like an omelet? Would you like a Monte Cristo? He would reel this off and you would be kind of caught off guard and he would say, oh, yeah, I'll have this. And then you would find yourself as the only person at the table eating. So you had to learn always to say no.
Yeah.
At any rate, that was one of the scenes of these interviews. I would sit there and there were often other people there, and then I had to wait until the room cleared and then we could have a moment of private conversation. Or the other place was up a very grand staircase. And at the top of the staircase, there was his study. And to call it baronial would be to underplay it. And it ran the entire length of the house. So basically a quarter of a Manhattan block. And I think that's one of the reasons that some of this is difficult to hear is the size of this room with its double height ceiling. All of the sound is absorbed.
So I have a question. Michael, one of the things I found fascinating about this clip was as he was describing Trump's behavior, he applied it to you and your wife, who he named and posited as an object of Trump's would-be seduction.
I sit there going, this is just amazing. And he'd say, Michael, come on, let's go to the office. And he'd say, tell me, what's it like now? He'd say, do you like having sex with your wife? How often do you? He'd say, it's great. Seriously, Michael, how often do you have sex with you? I mean, don't you want the trouble? You and I can go upstairs or tomorrow, come over. There's this girl's coming in from Los Angeles, probably or Hawaiian tropic Hawaiian. So come over with your car. You're gonna have a great time. I promise you, Michael. It's just me and you. You're gonna have a great time. Be up here at 3 o'clock. We can go upstairs. The whole time, Victoria's been on the phone, listening, setting it up. Because he wants to Victoria.
Did that seem strange to you at the time?
Well, at the time it didn't. Listening to the clip, it now seems extremely strange. And I had to go and ask my wife, is this okay? And she said, I'll take one for the country. But I think that was a sort of Epstein kind of thing. I mean, he was actually a very good storyteller. So he just suddenly personalized this. It would be you in that position. And he would be talking about your wife.
Yeah. But I mean, as he did that, he kind of challenged or took away your boundaries, which I guess is convincing storytelling.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting for people to hear Epstein suddenly as the real life guy in these tapes, because he's less, I mean, we've come to think of him clearly as the monster of our time.
Yeah.
And in these tapes, even as he details Trump's behavior in his own less than acceptable behavior, he still comes off as someone quite thoughtful and quite incisive about his friend Donald Trump.
Yes. And just to locate these in time, this was 2017. Trump had just come into office. Epstein had had his first run-in with the law in Palm Beach, but gotten free. That's right.
Epstein went to jail in 2008. He was out of jail, living his life, occupying this incredible house, going on as though nothing had happened to him. His house was still filled with the good and the great, the high and the mighty.
Such as?
I mean, I think we know a lot of these names, from Bill Gates to Larry Summers to Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel.
Yeah.
To Noam Chomsky. It was kind of an incredible cast of characters. I think the reasons that they were there were complicated reasons, or perhaps not complicated reasons. They were there because it was an incredibly interesting place to be. And if there were people involved with Epstein's other side, of which I never saw any indication of, I didn't know that. But even having said that, I suppose I did see, I mean, there were always a background of girls at Epstein's house. I never thought any of these girls were necessarily underage. Actually, none of them did seem to be underage, but they were a kind of cast of characters of these women who he employed as assistants. And, I have no idea what they did other than provide this backdrop to this, I suppose, hedonistic lifestyle. Although, again, other than their presence, there was no indication of that. Most of the time, Epstein spent talking economic affairs and international affairs and politics as though he were a man at the center of the world's affairs.
You had said on Friday that he'd become frightened of Donald Trump. I assume that this was a moment when he was frightened of Donald Trump because Trump had come into office.
Yes. I mean, he never said, I am afraid for my life here, but there were many times at which I tried to urge him to go public with his views about Trump. And what he indicated was that I was somehow an innocent, that I didn't know how the world worked or how Donald Trump worked.
What was his motivation in talking to you and telling these actually incredibly reckless stories about Trump?
I mean, many people have told me that they're incredible and reckless stories about Donald Trump. I don't think this is unique to Jeffrey Epstein. People who have known Donald Trump cannot believe how history has unfolded. The fact that Donald Trump became the president of the United States, will be the president again, is beyond explanation to many people who have had any kind of an experience with Donald Trump.
Yes.
So I came along and I had known Epstein at various points. And the fact that I was writing this book, which curiously, Epstein, well before I knew it, saw that this book would be quite incendiary and would, in some sense, define the early Trump era. And I think that was an opportunity for him to begin to understand what had happened here and to fill in pieces that he possessed.
Okay. We know that many people who have been kind of cast aside by Trump kind of want to worm their way back in. Was Epstein one of those?
Oh, I wonder. I think that's a good question. I don't think so, since he was telling me all of this. I don't think that he saw that as a possibility. I think he understood what you would have to do to get back into Trump's good graces if you wanted to, and he was not going to do that. At the same time, he knew a lot of people around Donald Trump. A lot of Donald Trump's friends were Jeffrey Epstein's friends.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a weird thing going on here. Maybe there was some degree that he felt like he was the shunned friend and therefore left to tell tales out of school. That may have been part of it.
Yes. Among all the drama that has unfolded in the last 3 days, I mean, I've read a lot of questions from people why you waited until the week of the election, the week before the election, to start releasing this material. Why did we do that?
Well, I mean, the reason we did it is because of the model Stacey Williams, who came out last week and described her interaction with Trump while she was Jeffrey Epstein's girlfriend. That was the immediate reason we did this. And frankly, that was what gave us the idea. Yeah. I hadn't particularly thought about this before. And one of the reasons I hadn't thought about this is that I've had this material for quite a long time now. I have discussed this material with virtually every major media outlet. I've said, this is a great story. This is explosive stuff. We ought to be done with it. And there has been an interesting pattern of immediate and great interest. And then a kind of sense, as it's discussed among media executives, of people saying, this is, Epstein, life is too short. This stuff is too difficult. It is too problematic to present Epstein as someone other than the worst kind of criminal. And here we are now positioning him as a somewhat knowledgeable insider. And there have been a lot of occasions. There was a big discussion with Netflix that was led by one of the most prominent people in the business making these kind of docudramas. And Netflix said, no way do we want to do this. Sky in the UK actually commissioned a script on this. And then suddenly there were, and I was around this table, a lot of executives with the script and saying, who thought this was a good idea? Jeffrey Epstein. And then virtually every network and cable channel that has had a documentary or nonfiction narrative outlet saw this material 2 summers ago, I guess. And everybody took an incredibly interested meeting. They were all shown extensive parts of this, and then they all passed. So from my own point of view, it's like, okay, you just got to get on with your life here. And so I sort of put it on the back burner, thinking that this is important stuff. At some point, there would be a way to tell this story. We'll be back right after the break.
Or wherever you get your
You know that rush of endorphins you feel?
Muhammad Ali, George Foreman, James
Foreman basically just punched himself out.
Welcome to Rumble, the story of a world in
I think this particular clip is really, you have to concentrate and listen to. So getting the version with the subtitles, which the Daily Beast has done a terrific job on, is worthwhile. But the interesting thing here is I ask Epstein how he knows all this stuff, and he kind of responds with some incredulity and says, well, I was Trump's closest friend for 10 years. And I think that's the point here.
So how do you know this?
That was closest friend.
So I need the dump. Just give me dump.
And then he does this. He tells this this funny story about Trump's scalp reduction surgery, because Trump is as bald as any guy with male pattern baldness.
You probably know he has scalp reduction. Just get the same male pattern baldness that we all have. He had his scalp sterile.
One other point is that I wrote quite extensively about this in a book that I published 2 years ago, a book called Too Famous. It sort of tells the story of people gathering in Epstein's house to talk about his legal difficulties. It also includes a long section with Steve Bannon, who Epstein has befriended, and Bannon has befriended Epstein. They've befriended each other over their shared incredulity about Donald Trump. And Bannon comes in to give Epstein media training because there's a thought that Epstein could go on a national show, 60 Minutes, for instance, and address all of his legal problems and somehow get himself out of the fix, the mortal fix, as it turns out, that he seemed clearly to be headed toward.
Yeah. I remember that was the last section of the book. It was riveting. And you felt that Epstein at that point was in the same sort of state that Harvey Weinstein was in when he was first accused. And he said, oh, I'll make a film about it. And, didn't understand the seriousness of it.
I mean, Epstein certainly did not understand the seriousness of it, as everyone around him kept telling him how serious it was. I remember his lawyer was in one of these conversations, and his lawyer said, and this is what kind of gives me a shiver, his lawyer said, Jeffrey, listen to me. This is bad. This is heart attack bad.
Wow. So do we know if Donald Trump personally is aware of what you've done in releasing it?
I think it's interesting. Let's look at the statement that the Trump campaign.
Oh, it's too good. I got to read it.
Yeah.
Michael Wolff is a disgraced writer who routinely fabricates lies in order to sell fiction books because he clearly has no morals or ethics. He waited until days before the election to make outlandish false smears, all in an effort to engage in blatant election interference on behalf of Kamala Harris. He's a failed journalist that is resorting to lying for attention. Well done, Michael. That's pretty great.
Yes.
That's from Stephen Chung.
Right. No, Stephen, who's actually an incredibly nice guy, but his fame in the Trump camp is that he issues these kind of flamethrower statements.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they go, we need a flamethrower statement. Get Stephen to write it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, just to do the Trump split screen thing, there's another person in the campaign who I called and I said, these tapes are going to come out and this is what's going to be on them. And this person couldn't stop laughing. So, but also the nature of this thing, this is a kind of a boilerplate statement. I mean, there are many other names that could be replaced with mine here. But the interesting thing is this conceit about saying things that would be negative to Trump before the election is election interference, when it seems to me that is the very nature of an election campaign. I mean, what is the alternative? You know something and you don't say it because that would change people's minds.
Do you think his staff is going to try and shield him from it?
Well, yeah, that's the other thing that would go on here. The imperative would be to keep this clamped down and not to get to the point at which they have to speak to Trump about it. Because if they have to speak to Trump about it, then Trump would blow up and then he would say something and make it a much more bigger deal than it already is.
Yes.
And the other thing to note about this statement is that they don't say that anything is untrue.
Yeah, and of course, the other immediate impact on Friday was the Congressman Steve Cohen brought up in Congress about the evidence that the FBI retrieved from Epstein's safe and asked that an inquiry be opened to find out what happened to the photographs. Can you just remind us what the photographs were of?
The photographs, Epstein on several occasions would take out these photographs of Donald Trump and the set of girls that were at Epstein's house in Palm Beach. And in the pictures, and there were possibly a half a dozen of them, and Epstein used to kind of flick them around like playing cards. There were girls around the swimming pool. They were all topless. One specifically, I remember a girl sitting on Trump's lap. And in another, Trump has a stain on the front of his pants, which the girls, 3 or 4, are pointing at and laughing. Epstein used to go to his safe, take these pictures out, and then return them to the safe. It is quite possible that they were in the safe when the FBI raided the house, although, of course, I don't know that.
Okay. And you believe that the FBI either has them or destroyed them?
I don't know. I just know that that's where they were. He kept them in his safe, and the FBI ultimately raided that safe and took the contents of the safe.
Yeah. That was the safe in New York.
In New York, in the house on 71st Street. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So having listened to these tapes, I mean, the immediate conclusion anyone has to make is they're both awful people. What's the larger lesson to be gleaned from this?
I think I said in our conversation last week that it's just this glaring kind of extraordinary circumstance that these two guys who are really very similar in their levels of corruption, and one ends up in the darkest prison in the country and the other in the White House.
Yeah.
So explaining that is, talking about a shiver up your back. That really is something that history has to resolve. I think partly the reminder of these tapes is that Trump comes from this world. Epstein's world, which we now see as one of the darkest places in modern culture, is also the place that Trump comes from. And you can call it the sort of the 80s and the 90s and possibly in some way rationalize it that way. But again, one guy went to the darkest prison and the other guy to the White House.
Do you think the only thing that separated them was sort of Epstein's sordid predilection for underage girls? Otherwise, they're essentially the same character?
I think that Epstein was never very interested in being anything but Jeffrey Epstein. He didn't have a double character or a triple character or much of a interest in hiding who he was. And Donald Trump, who he was constantly being created and recreated.
Yes.
So, suddenly, he had a television show in which he was the consummate businessman. Then he became a politician and then the president.
Yes.
So I think Donald Trump ends up in the White House because of a sleight of hand, really.
Whose sleight of hand?
Well, his own sleight of hand. I'm a magician. His relationship with Epstein is really hiding in plain sight, has hidden in plain sight. But pay no attention to that. I can distract you from that with whatever is happening over here, this other distraction.
Yes. And it is an astonishing image when you think of Epstein and, whatever one thinks of him, a last desperate act in jail, trying to kill himself with a bedsheet while Trump sat in the White House. I mean, astonishing.
Yeah, no, I get, speaking again of another shiver, the idea that Epstein was speaking to me so that I would be the channel from which he could speak from the grave. It's kind of, I don't know.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did he want redemption?
I don't know if he wanted redemption. I mean, I actually said on many occasions, You just have to tell this story publicly, and your contribution to humanity will redeem you.
I'm not sure that played out.
I'm not sure he necessarily believed that, or I'm not sure he necessarily wanted that. I mean, all Epstein wanted, I think, was his peculiar, eccentric, and sordid life.
Right. Yes.
But maybe he wanted revenge too. Maybe that's my purpose.
Fire and Fuel